Ashton Jeanty is the best running back prospect since who? We'll tell you on this episode of the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Here are your hosts, Marcus Mosher and Kate Madjuk.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Kate Madjuk. You can follow her on Twitter at Kate Madjuk. On today's show, we are starting our prospect profile pieces. And of course, we're going to start with Ashton Jeanty, who is widely considered the best player in this draft. Kate, what do we need to know about Ashton Jeanty?
Let's start with the basics. So, Marcus, I think we all know there's a lot of hype here for Ashton Jeanty. He's already finding his way into like the top 2, top 3 running back conversations overall in Dynasty. Running back out of Boise State, coming out of the Mountain West Conference. He's 21 years old, junior, former 4-star recruit. He's 5'9", 218 pounds. I think you might have a little skepticism there that he might be, I don't know, somewhere closer
a
to
little
5.
Shorter.
Maybe
You'd be the first
small.
guy to lie about their height, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, hey, I'm 5'3". I wish I was 5'4". That inch matters, but he's such a well-balanced prospect overall, where he wins pretty much everywhere. Contact balance, vision. But I think the contact balance is what makes Ashton Jeanty so special, especially from a tape perspective. The stats on their own, pretty incredible. 2,600 rushing yards this year. 2,600, average 7.0 yards per carry, 29 rushing touchdowns, 30 scrimmage touchdowns. Like, this man was just ungodly productive, right? Second in Heisman voting. So how does that feel like it encapsulates Ashton Jeanty? Because the production profile speaks for itself. I think the tape speaks for itself. He, look at that size. I know he's a little on the shorter side, but that compact frame, I think, is what makes him so special at, bouncing off of contact. He literally looks like a pinball in a machine at times, where he's, scrummaging around the field and he goes into a pile, and then all of a sudden he pops back out and he can re-accelerate, take it to the house. He's got speed. So like, he kind of feels like the perfect prospect in this class, coming off a year in 2024 where there was no perfect prospect.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to like about Ashton Jeanty. By the way, I've got his stats or his size from last spring: 5'0", so basically 5'8.5", 215. If he runs at the NFL Combine, I'm not sure that he will or won't, but his expected 40 time is 4.42. It's pretty accurate. I mean, it might be 0.03 of a second off in either direction, but you're looking at a low 4.4 running back. You talked about all the positive things. Like there are a lot of things here that get you really excited. The contact balance is great. He runs low to the ground. You watch it hit a bunch of home runs. Here's some of the things that I have that concern me. And I don't want to feel like grumpy old man here talking about Ashton Jeanty, but I will do it a little bit.
This is the basics. So we talked about the strengths, right? The contact balance, the power, the ability to hit those home runs, but he's not a prospect without any flaws. So hit on the flaws for me.
He had 374 carries this year, 279 over the final 9 games. I don't think Josh Jacobs had over 300 carries for his entire career coming out of Alabama, and he was a first-round pick. I mean, we get concerned about players that have a lot of wear and tear on their tires coming into the NFL, and Jeanty's the perfect example of it. He's also not overly big. 5'8.5", 215 pounds, to have that many touches on his body is a little concerning, but he's been durable. He hasn't missed any time. I think the difference for me when you're comparing Ashton Jeanty to, like, let's say Bijan Robinson in the 2023 classes, I see a very good athlete, but not a special athlete. And I think Bijan was a lot more. I think Genty's a little bit more linear, where you see Bijan make some unbelievable jukes in the hole, a little Saquon Barkley like, and I just don't think that's Jeanty. Um, but again, we're nitpicking a little bit, and this is what you have to do when you're talking about like elite talent. So I think he's a awesome prospect, but I have to admit I like Jahmyr Gibbs and Bijan Robinson better as prospects. I still think Jeanty is going to go very, very high in the draft.
Yeah, I think we're projecting him for a top 10, top 12 pick at this point in this draft class. And who knows what this pre-draft process is going to bring, right? We see guys make that jump into the top 8. Like we see them fall down a couple spots, but there's no doubt that we're projecting him as a first round pick. Now, as far as weaknesses go, I think one of the important things to hit on is that high workload coming out of college. When we're looking at first round running backs dating back to 2010, 19 running backs have been drafted in the first round since 2010. Not a single one of them had more than 686 rush attempts in their collegiate career. Ezekiel Elliott, 592. Saquon Barkley, 671. Bijan Robinson, 539. That contrasts pretty significantly when you're looking at Ashton Jeanty, who comes out with 750 touches. And like you mentioned, 750 rush attempts. As far as scrimmage touches go, he's still far and beyond. He wasn't even overly involved as a receiver here in this
No.
past 2024 season. Jeanty has had 830 touches over the course of his collegiate career. None of those other first round running backs dating back to 2010 has had more than 788 scrimmage touches over their collegiate span. It's definitely something I think to be aware of at a position where the touches, they do matter. The career touches do matter. And that kind of workload on a body, yes, he's got the home run hitting speed. So, I think he's got the ability to maybe avoid contact and avoid some unnecessary contact.
It's just
But
not his game, though. He loves contact.
he's great at contact. He's great with contact. He's great at playing through contact. But I do think, it's going to be a plus, just considering the fact that, like, again, home run hitting ability, led the NCAA in explosive plays this past season. Like, looking at all of those factors, he does avoid maybe some of the more brutal tackles up the gut if he's not
Yeah.
getting tackled on the
The,
first.
the other thing I want to say that again, we're talking about the smallest of knocks, right? When comparing him to generational prospects, we're not comparing him to Najee Harris or Josh Jacobs, who are first round running backs, because he's a lot better than those guys. We're comparing him to Bijan Robinson, Saquon Barkley, Ezekiel Elliott, those guys. Is that, Zeke played at Ohio State, Saquon played at Penn State, and Bijan played at Texas. Every week you got to see him go against NFL caliber defenders. That just wasn't the case for Ashton Jeanty. Now, he did have a really good game against Oregon, I believe in week 1, week 2. But the next big time game they played was Penn State in the final game of the year, and they really bottled him up. Now, again, Penn State's entire defense was focused on taking away Ashton Jeanty, but it makes me feel more confident about a player when I get to see Saquon Barkley running up against Ohio State and then Michigan State, rather than some of the schools that Ashton Jeanty got to play. And that's why, Kate, we've seen since 2010, I think only 2 non-Power 5 running backs get drafted in the first round, Rashad Penny and Doug Martin. It just doesn't happen very often. It doesn't mean that it can't work. It doesn't mean that Ashton Jeanty's not going to be successful in the NFL. It just makes the evaluation a little bit harder.
Yeah, and I think if you would have seen this production, let's say Ashton Jeanty went to a bigger program,
If he was at Michigan, right?
if he was at Michigan, if he came out of Ohio State, I mean, there would be absolutely zero questions, I think, about Jeanty in terms of, his translation to the next level. We're nitpicking here because that's kind of what we have to do. And when we're, evaluating Jeanty in the grand scheme of things and comparing him to some of the best, I think you have to answer some of these questions. But like, There's absolutely no doubt that he is an outstanding running back.
Yes.
His 2024 season ranks second all-time in rushing yards in the NCAA, 27 yards shy of Barry Sanders' 1988 record at Oklahoma State. Like, he had 100+ rushing yards in every single one of his games this season.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
200+ rushing yards in 6 of those games, scored in all but 2. The production profile, like,
It's off the chart. We're going to get to the advanced metrics in a second, but like the
yes.
production's off the chart. One of my favorite stats about Ashton Jeanty is that he had a 50-yard touchdown run in 9 of the 14 games he played this year.
That's nuts. It's nuts. And like, let's just say, so I do want to kind of, before we move on and look at some of the more advanced metrics, I want to say that, like, so we have this question mark about the school, right? And like the program and the competition level that he faced in the Mountain West Conference, right? But if you're going to be in a smaller program, we need to see you dominate to the level that Jeanty did dominate.
Yep.
So like, he checks that box. It's just kind of an extra unknown. So I want to
I had
put that
a
caveat.
scout tell me one time, Kate, that if a player plays at a smaller school, they better walk on water.
Mhm.
I think Jeanty kind of did that at Boise
Yeah.
State. Let's talk about the analytic profile for Ashton Jeanty. And as you would expect, it's very, very good. We will get to that next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there is no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or just want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because I can't always catch opening tip off just because I've got a couple of kids at home, but I love jumping into the middle of the game in the third quarter, and I can still place my bets on my phone in the app. Plus, the app is so easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That is FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets, and make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We are discussing Boise State running back Ashton Jeanty. And Kate, let's dive into some of the advanced numbers here. And as you would expect, they are silly.
They're stupid. They're stupid good. Now let's start just with like the advanced metrics. We talked about size. When we're looking at the percentiles for his height, weight, etc. At 5'9" and 215 pounds, which is the measurement I'm rolling with as of right now. We will see if that shall change. BMI is in the 85th percentile. So I know shorter running backs, not necessarily, the most exciting. Sometimes you don't have that same level of vision because you can't see over the top of like your offensive lineman, for example. That's why height could be something worth considering. But in terms of his frame, because he is a little bit shorter, he's still got that stocky frame that, the BMI is kind of what I care about the most in terms of like that affecting his play style, because he is a physical runner. He's low to the ground, and that contact balance, I think, comes from that lower center of gravity. But he's not like a slight 5'8", 5'9". He's a bigger boy, right? When we look at the production profile, 43.7% dominator rating from player profiler, holy moly, 96th percentile for the running back position, 10.8% college target share. That's 84th percentile. So what those numbers tell us is that he was the entire offense there at Boise State. He took over just about everything. I think he had like 30 fewer rush attempts than the entire team had pass attempts. Like, he was everything to that team. And what did he do with it, Marcus? Tell us about his advanced percentiles over the past 2 years?
Yeah, they're stupid. Rush grade 95th percentile, missed forced tackles per attempt, 100th percentile. That's pretty good. Yards after contact per attempt, 99th percentile. Receiving grade 91st percentile, missed forced tackle per reception, 99th percentile. One of the best stats that we have for running backs is that the second one that I mentioned, the missed forced tackles per attempt. A couple of years ago, we saw Bijan Robinson be number 1 on that list. And Ashton Jeanty has since passed him. So that's a pretty good indicator. Like if you're creating plays after contact, you're making guys miss. That's generally what translates really well in the NFL. So from an analytic perspective, if you are going to draft a first round running back, Ashton Jeanty hits all the marks. So that's good. Like you need that. You can't have somebody that struggles in one area. That part feels really good. The other thing is we saw this year against top 25 teams, he averaged 5.8 yards per attempt, 87 carries for 505 yards, 4 touchdowns. Now that's down a little bit from his overall average, but still, you're averaging over 5.5 yards per carry per attempt against good teams. That's a great thing. The other thing that I really like, Kate, is that we saw his yards per carry. They didn't really change based on the quarter. In fact, in fourth quarters this year, he averaged 7.5 yards per carry. I will say there is one thing that has me a little concerned, and it's his yards per carry by month. September 9.3, October 6.9, November 6.0, December 5.0. So it was trending in the wrong direction. Maybe that's just teams were more focused on Ashton Jeanty. Maybe he was wearing down. I don't know. These are good questions that need to be asked. But overall, from an analytic perspective, this is as good as it gets.
How would you say analytically we're seeing Jeanty compared to some of the other, like, quote unquote generational prospects here in, the Barkleys, the Zekes?
Well,
Like,
from an analytic perspective, he's better than all of those guys. And again, as you would expect from somebody who's playing at Boise State rather than
yeah.
Penn State or Ohio State or Texas. But again, it just checks the box. You shouldn't draft a running back only based on their analytic profile. But in the case of Ashton Jeanty, he just checks that box and he checks it better than anybody else has ever checked it. So again, I'm not trying to crush him because I do like Bijan and Jahmyr Gibbs better. But man, you can see why he's being valued so highly and why so many people think he is an outstanding running back prospect.
I mean, yeah, he checks pretty much every single box in that regard. Now, something I do think is kind of worth considering here, maybe in the grand scheme of things. Let's talk about his abilities as a pass blocker. I feel like that's something we didn't hit on in the first segment, but something that we can, technically quantify. Thanks to our friends over at PFF. 9 pressures allowed here in the 2024 campaign, had 105 pass blocking opportunities, graded out with an efficiency grade of 95.2 in terms of his PFF pass blocking efficiency grade. So it's actually not great in the grand scheme of things.
No.
You don't love to see those pressures allowed, and it does show up on tape, right? So for a guy that has a ton of play strength, it doesn't necessarily show up as much in the blocking scheme. And I do think some of that has to do with like momentum. He's a player that just plays with a ton of momentum. So like
Plays downhill. Yep.
once he starts going, he's gone. But when he's like got his feet planted, he can be popped off his feet, I think, relatively quickly. That does show up in some of these more advanced metrics, like the pressures allowed, the offensive blocking efficiency. Like it does show up on tape as well as the numbers.
You're right. I just don't know how much coaches are going to care because
Yeah.
what they care, most running backs, if not all running backs coming out of college, struggle in pass protection. It's just not something they're asked to do very often. But what coaches care about is effort and play strength. Like if you have the effort and you are a stronger player, they'll teach you the technique and they'll teach you how to be in the right spot so you don't get your quarterback killed. And that's what I saw from Jeanty on tape. He's got a lot of things that can be refined in that area, but I don't think his pass blocking is so bad that he's going to be asked to be coming off the field on third down, the way that like a Derrick Henry was earlier in his career, or even Derrick Henry now. And I think that's what makes him a little bit different from some of these guys is I do think he is a good enough pass blocker and a good enough receiver to be on the field basically every down.
Yeah, I think that's 100% fair. And again, kind of nitpicking here because we don't have we're talking about the analytics. What do the analytics say? They say go
Yeah.
full speed ahead. So I, again, always want to present like two sides. And the other side to Jeanty is that even the negatives aren't super
No.
negative.
Let's talk about his current dynasty value and some player comps that we have for him. We will get to that next. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. For your second listen, check out the new Locked On NFL show. 2 shows every single day. One in the morning with Tyler Rowland, one in the afternoon with Tony Wiggins, available wherever you get your podcasts. All right, Kate, let's talk about his dynasty value right now. I want to, because we don't have it included in the current batch of Dynasty League Football ADP, I want to run through some running backs and you tell me where you would value him. So would you take Ashton Jeanty on a rookie contract ahead of Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, Saquon Barkley, any of those guys?
For me, it's Bijan, Gibbs, and then we've got Jeanty here at RB3 in Dynasty. And I think that feels pretty fair. I know, from an age perspective, from a, coming in contract perspective, like this guy is technically fresh to the NFL. He's going to come in, get a 4-year deal with a 5th-year option. Like that safety is really nice, especially at the running back position when we know the second contracts can be kind of a scary situation at that position in particular. But I still think the safety of knowing Bijan Robinson, what he did at a bigger program when finally given the opportunity, Jahmyr Gibbs, for example, like we know what these players are.
Yes.
The biggest question for me, again, with Jeanty more or less comes down to how does the small time program, because remember the players that were drafted, first round running backs drafted out of non-Power 5 conferences, what you mentioned, Rashad Penny,
and Doug Martin, I believe.
Doug Martin didn't necessarily translate to a lot of long-term success here in the National Football League. Good football players, but not necessarily proven in the same way. And you look at their production profiles, coming out of their respective programs, they dominated at the collegiate level, and they answered those marks. Like, can you produce? Can you walk on water at a smaller program? Those guys did, and it didn't work out.
So here's what I would say for his value. I agree with you on Bijan and Gibbs because Bijan and Gibbs are in really good situations in good offensive lines. They're playing in domes. Yeah. We just know we know what to expect from both those guys. And that's high-end RB1 production. I expect the same for Ashton Jeanty, but pre-draft, there's a little bit more unknown here, right? Like there's a chance he could go to the Raiders at 6 who want to establish the run. And that's just not as good of a situation as what the Falcons and the Lions have. And he would knock them a little bit. Or he could end up like in Dallas and he's playing on a better offense. And maybe you would move him ahead of 1 or 2 of those guys. But as we stand here pre-draft, I have him below those 2 guys, but firmly as RB3. And I think there's a pretty big gap between him and the next running back. My question for you is this, Kate. If you're looking at Ashton Jeanty beyond running backs, how do you value him between guys like Brock Bowers and Drake London and Marvin Harrison Jr.? How do you feel about him in that range?
I think for me, this comes down to some of the, the question marks about how you plan to build your team. I'm generally speaking always going to opt for the receivers. Some of the assets that I think I'm projecting for more longevity. That being said, I still think I probably lean Jeanty in those circumstances right now. And that's with me projecting or hopefully wishing this into existence, Jeanty to the Dallas Cowboys. If Jeanty goes to the Raiders. I still think he's going to be a phenomenal player. I think the Raiders in general probably going to be a better offense than we're projecting right now at the current state of things. I think that's probably going to be my tiebreaker. But if Jeanty ends up with the Cowboys, I'm going to take him ahead of London, ahead of Bowers, etc.
Let's do some situations. You just tell me up, down, or neutral landing spot. Jacksonville Jaguars at 5. I think that's a little rich for him, but go ahead.
Up.
Okay. Las Vegas Raiders.
Down.
New Orleans Saints.
Neutral.
Chicago Bears at 10 with Ben Johnson.
Up.
Dallas up. What about the Bengals at 17?
Neutral.
What about the Broncos at 20?
Down.
Down. I just don't trust Sean Payton at all. Steelers at 21.
Down.
Chargers at 22.
Up.
Yeah. I think generally we like him in most spots. There are a couple landing spots that could be some landmines for him, but I think for the most part, you're going to see his value stay the same or go up once we get to the draft. The last thing, Kate, I have for us is comps on Ashton Jeanty. It's one of the hardest things to do when it comes to player evaluations, but there are a lot of GMs out there where they want to know player comps before they draft somebody, and they'll ask everybody around the room, do you have a player comp for Ashton Jeanty or no?
I don't. Give me yours, Marcus.
So I've seen a lot of people compare him to LaDainian Tomlinson, and I think that's too big of a stretch. I don't think people remember how great of a prospect LaDainian Tomlinson really was. I've seen Marshawn some comps, and I think his running style is a little bit like that.
I think the tape could complement Marshawn quite well.
I want you to think back to 2020, like mid-season 2020, when we saw J.K. Dobbins just running all through NFL defenses at that 5'8", 220-pound frame. Dobbins pre-injury, I mean, remember, forget all those injuries that happened, but like pre-injury ran incredibly low to the ground. He wasn't like the most shifty running back, right? Like that just wasn't his game. But he was so good at bouncing off contact. And that's why he would average 5.5, 6 yards per carry every single season. That's who he reminds me of, like the A+ version of J.K. Dobbins. And I know people are going to listen to that and roll their eyes, but that was an awesome, awesome player before he got injured.
Yeah, I think people are, if people are poo-pooing, I think it's probably more to do with the way that Dobbins panned out. And
I'm more talking about the play style, by the way.
Yeah, I think play style, that sounds pretty fair in terms of like what they bring to the table, like the way that J.K. Dobbins can just pop off any block and recharge and make that explosive play. Like that's what Jeanty does super, super well.
Yep.
Plays like a bowling ball and like a pinball off of defenders. I think that's a pretty intriguing comp. It's not the sexiest comp. It's not Marshawn Lynch,
or LaDainian Tomlinson, but he's a different type of run. He's not somebody that's going to put on these unbelievable juke moves. It's going to be smoother, and he's just going to do it without a lot of brute force and lower body strength. And I think that can really work out in the NFL.
Yeah, I think Jeanty probably, one of the safest running backs that you can find in Dynasty right now, just because I think, as we mentioned, the floor seems pretty safe regardless of landing spot. Even if he lands with the Raiders, I think if he lands with the Raiders, it's probably going to be with the intention to build the offense around Ashton Jeanty, right? Like there's a lot of landing spots where I think even if it's not a great landing spot on a high-powered offense, he's probably going there to shape the offense for the years to come. Like there's, I think a lot of safety here in Ashton Jeanty and his upside for Dynasty.
All right, that is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty Football your first listen every single day. On tomorrow's show, it's a Wednesday, so Matt Williamson will be here. Kate will be off, but we'll be back on Thursday continuing some of these prospect profiles, so make sure you tune in for that. Go download the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on all platforms. Follow Kate on Twitter at Kate Majuk. I'm at Marcus_Mosier, and we will see you right back here on Wednesday.